Welcome to Chapter 8 of Intro to Psychology. In this video, we'll be discussing theories of memory. There are three basic processes that allow our brains to remember information. And those are encoding, storage, and retrieval. So encoding is putting information into memory, storage is keeping that information, and then retrieval is remembering that information, taking it out of memory and bringing it into conscious awareness. One of the earliest memory models that described this process was the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, first published in 1968. The three basic stages of this model are found here in this diagram. So first, there's sensory memory, and that is where information from your senses that gets quickly processed by your brain and then is sent to short-term memory, which is a period of about anywhere from 1 second to maybe about 15 or 30 seconds, where you are able to keep certain information in your mind for a short period of time. And then anything longer than 30 seconds is considered long-term memory. Anything that you're able to put into long-term memory and keep in your mind and remember longer than 30 seconds, we give it that designation as being long. So remembering something for a minute would be considered long-term memory. And so the three processes that we described earlier are also found in this diagram. Encoding is just taking in information from the world and putting it into sensory memory. And then by paying attention to certain information, you're putting it into short-term memory. And then in order to get something from short-term memory into long-term memory, one strategy that you can use is to rehearse that information. So you maintain that information in short-term memory, and eventually it transfers into long-term memory after rehearsing it, and we call that process consolidation. And then lastly, when you want to retrieve something from memory, we would call that retrieval or remembering or recall. And we'll define those terms a little bit more specifically later. So for example, let's say that someone is trying to give you directions to get to their house. So when you're listening to them and watching them give you directions, that's information going into your sensory memory. And then you might rehearse the information they've given to you a few times. That would be rehearsal, and that would allow you to transfer it from short-term memory into long-term memory. And then when let's say you're driving and trying to make follow the directions and make a good turn, you'd be retrieving that information from long-term memory. Another popular model of memory is the Baddeley and Hitch model of memory, which was first published in 1974. And in this model, sensory memory is encoded into one of three types of short-term memory, and it depends on the type of sensory information that comes in. So in this model, visual information goes into a construct called the visual spatial sketchpad, whereas auditory information, sounds, goes into something called the phonological loop. And then the information from both of those sources are connected by something called an episodic buffer, which is something that binds together multiple sensory experiences into singular episodes. So these are all constructs, these are all concepts of how memory might work. These aren't reflected in real neural anatomical structures, but just an idea based on research about how different forms of information go into long-term memory. So using the same example of getting directions from someone, in this model, when you are thinking about the directions, I know that when someone gives me directions, I tend to imagine a map. It's like I'm drawing a sketch pad, and I'm drawing out in your mind the turns that I should be making. We would call that visual information going into your brain, something that's being done by the visual spatial sketchpad. Whereas the auditory information, remembering the instructions, would go into the phonological loop. And it's a loop, it's something that's rehearsed over and over again. So here's another diagram that shows us how to think about and organize a long-term memory. So once again, you have sensory memory, which is a second or less. And then you have short-term memory, which some people would say would be 15 to 30 seconds or maybe less than a minute. And then long-term memory, anything longer than a minute to potentially lifetime. And there are two main first divisions of long-term memory, and those are explicit memory and implicit memory. So explicit memory, those are things that are conscious, things that we consciously are able to recall and remember. And we often further categorize explicit memory as declarative memory. So it's things that we are able to declare with our own words or with our own minds. And we further divide that into episodic memory and semantic memory. So when we say episodic memory, we're talking about information from events that we have personally experienced. We also call it autobiographical memory. So things like remembering what it was like at your 16th birthday party, or remembering the events that led up to a car crash, your kind of personal video camera recordings of experiences that you have been through. And then there's semantic memory, which is your memory for words or concepts or ideas or facts. So knowing the definition of a word, or knowing who the first president of the United States was. Those basic facts that you can just immediately retrieve from memory, we would call semantic memories. And then as we go to the other side of this diagram, the other split of long-term memory, implicit memory. So these are things that are unconscious. Things like skills or tasks that we might further classify as procedural memory. So implicit memories, once again, things that you don't consciously think about, or you don't actively say or think your way through every part of the task while using that memory. So when we talk about procedural memories, those would be things like riding a bike or driving a car. When you're first learning to ride a bike, it's a very active process. You have to think about each step and make sure your balance is right. But after you've learned it and you've been riding a bike for years, you can kind of just hop on a bike and automatically start pedaling without thinking about it, right? Very, very different than, say, the processes involved in episodic memory, where you're thinking consciously about every single step of the way when you're trying to do something, or when you're remembering something that happened to you. Or very different than semantic memory. If you're trying to explain a math concept to someone, you're thinking very consciously about every step. Not so in procedural memories. Those are unconscious, those are implicit. Next, when we talk about remembering, we often use the word retrieval, as we stated earlier, the act of getting information out of memory storage and bringing it into conscious awareness, making it explicit. And there are three basic ways to retrieve information. The first is free recall. So that is just being able to access information and recall it, retrieve it without any cues, without any help. So for example, when you face an essay question on a test, or a kind of short answer question, you're being asked to freely recall information that you studied. A counter to that might be recognition. So that is when you are able to identify information that you've previously learned after encountering it a second time. By contrast, when you see a multiple choice question, let's say you have 4 options, the correct answer is in there somewhere. You just have to be able to recognize it. You don't have to retrieve it from memory on your own. And recognition memory is much easier because you're relying on cues. I should say it's much easier than free recall because of those cues that are helping you. Recognition memory is also very resistant to brain injury and many neurological diseases. So in people who have Alzheimer's disease, they might have great difficulty with free recall, but if you give them a multiple choice option, they might be able to pick the right answer much easier. And then there's relearning. That is learning information after, or I should say, relearning information that you've previously learned but have now forgotten. So for example, learning a language. You might have learned a language when you were very young, and then after not speaking it for many years, you forget all about it. And then going back and learning that language again is faster than learning it when you first tried, perhaps because of that relearning process, because you're activating neural networks that were previously already there. So in the next video, we'll be discussing parts of the brain that are involved in memory.